So I've not really had an affinity to melanoma until I met Bettina, actually, many, many years ago, which, was a pleasurable event, and also most recently Ian and Joe. So I find myself becoming increasingly passionate about melanoma and trying to use some of the experience we've had and successes we've had in myeloma, in melanoma, to see if we can help. So what my remit is today, it's not that complex, actually. It's just to think about how we can direct the available research resources that we have in a different way moving forward, so we can accelerate and advance developments to get innovation to patients quicker. And there's some good examples of where this has been done previously. So Ian very kindly introduced the three speakers as being expert. I'm actually not expert in anything, and the next 20 minutes will provide evidence of that. But I've been led to believe there's a significant unmet need in melanoma. I have been here for a couple of hours. I looked at the internet yesterday when people were posting on Facebook. And despite recent advances, there still seems to be considerable unmet need. And we could do with patients surviving longer and at least having a better quality of life. So there's no room for complacency. We can't stand still. We need to be very thoughtful in how we solve the problems of ocular melanoma. And for the most part, in almost every other cancer, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing in terms of the community. There's lots of duplication, there's lots of waste, there's lots of inefficiencies. And when you've got a common cancer, common disease, you may get away with that. Just on the basis of probability, you might get some hits. But in rare cancers, there's just not enough mud in the bucket that you would ever stand with your back against the wall and go like that, because the chances are nothing's going to stick. So you've got to put the bucket in the middle of the table and get all the experts round. We've only got a small amount of mud. That's all we have. What's the plan? And that's what we need in rare disease research. Notwithstanding the fact that a lot of the big innovations that have come from left field and right field, so we shouldn't forget about serendipity and chance, but actually we've got to think about having a strategy. So we know that ocular melanoma is rare, but it's one of probably 6,000 or 7,000 rare cancers and rare diseases that are treated on most health systems around Europe. Probably somewhere close to 95% of these diseases have got no licensed therapies. So when you hear the news in the UK, if you're from the UK, Cancer Research UK, Stand Up to Cancer, they give you the impression that cancer, the cure for cancer is around the corner tomorrow. And when you see the cancer statistics and it says that cancer survival has doubled, it can't have doubled in all cancers, because there's 200 cancers and there's a gazillion subtypes for which there's no treatment. So I think that the media and actually some patient organizations who are doing research do us a disservice by giving the impression we're further down than we are. That's not to say important developments have not been made. Of course they have, and we're super grateful for that. But I would argue that these developments are disproportionate to the time, effort, and considerable resources that go in to cancer research. So in any rare disease, there are some mitigating factors that makes research rare. There's lots of scarce resources. We don't have a gazillion patients to go into research. I think the first speaker of the session this afternoon said there was somewhere between 600 or 700 eye cancer patients in the UK. On average, probably around 20 to 30% of patients of any cancer will be eligible for a clinical trial. So that means there's probably somewhere between 1 and 200 patients per year to get onto a trial. If that trial is not the best trial, or that trial is not designed properly, it's a gigantic waste of everybody's time and effort. And we can't afford that in a rare disease. We have to make sure that patients go into the most important research. There is limited expertise. Again, I'm not an expert, but I think there's probably 3 or 4 centres. I'm looking for Joe or somebody in the UK. Gartnerville's one, Moorfield's the other. We just don't have the critical mass and expertise to move things forward quickly. There's always limited research funds, both philanthropic sometimes CRUK, I don't know how much money they invest in ocular melanoma. My guess is it's very, very small in comparison to what they invest in the big four. And even if they do invest, they probably invest in some sort of reactive grant model where they just look at the research in isolation, say, oh, that's quite good, we'll fund it. Whether or not it's part of a global plan or not, or as a plan for how to use that data to benefit patients, we don't know. So there's a lack of funds, and I've worked in the not-for-profit sector for 25 years, so I don't have a huge disposable income at the end of the month. I need to be very thoughtful in how I use that money so I can maximize my family's quality of life and make sure the kids get their football and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure 95% of people in the room are exactly the same. So we've got to think about scarcity and how we allocate these resources to get maximum patient benefit. And in research, we're very, very, very bad at doing that, even in common disease areas, never mind in rare disease areas. And of course, we rely on mostly the pharmaceutical industry for innovation. At least from a UK perspective, there is no innovation pathway to take academic research through product licensing, through NICE approval, through NHS commissioning, unless research data comes from industry. It has a marketing authorization, if it's a drug particularly, and it has a NICE badge. It's very difficult to get it paid for on the NHS. So without the pharmaceutical industry investing in the area, it's very difficult to see a pipeline of new treatment. And of course, we're not the only cancer. There's a limited pot in government, there's a limited pot at CRUK. We're competing with all the other rare cancers in the field for our share of the limelight. So the key thing for me, the success in research has got to be partly down to how we allocate these scarce resources. And I think patient organizations are changing. I think medical research organizations and medical research funders are changing. Even in the UK, they're changing. If anybody knows much about the Association of Medical Research Charities and you get to know some of the stuff they're doing, you can see that patient-driven medical research funding organizations are moving away from reactive grant-giving models where they'll raise some money, they'll invite the great and the good around the country to apply for grants, and these grants will be given out in small amounts of money. And that's okay, but you're never going to move the dial in melanoma to the extent that all of you guys in the room need. You need a kind of different strategy. So what medical research charities are doing now is bringing people together and saying, okay, we've got to think differently. If we go back to the mud in the bucket analogy, that mud, our lives depend on that mud. If that mud's not used properly, or someone's content to go like that, which is normally what happens in medical research, it's not good enough for us. So let's figure out what our plan is, what is our blueprint to use that mud carefully. I'm going to attempt to use this thing here.
Oh, that won't work.
Oh, it doesn't work. Is it not a laser pointer?
Oh, the laser.
Oh yeah, a laser pointer. So I think what we need in rare disease and what we need in ocular melanoma, given the unmet needs, is we need to define research priorities. We've got to figure out how we put in place a research blueprint nationally, pan-European, or globally, so we can start to allocate all of the scarce resources to the research that matters most. And what we've got to do is to make sure that the aggregation of all that research effort results in patient benefit. You could argue right now that there is no aggregation of research effort. If we get a paper in a journal or a talk at a conference or an abstract, that's about as good as it gets. That's not a bad thing, but it's not going to move the dial fast enough and far enough for you guys in the room. We've got to figure out how we can unify research efforts in academia, because mostly doctors sometimes work and think in isolation, and that's not a criticism. It's they work under huge pressure institutionally. They compete with other doctors for lab space, other doctors for funding for PhDs. They have to get tenure. They've got to publish papers to keep their jobs. They've got to get money coming into the department. I wish it was different, but that's the reality. And sometimes that means they have to make decisions in terms of what's best for the department and for them, rather than thinking, actually, is this research really important? And this is a good use of scarce resources in ocular melanoma. So we've got to think about how we can incentivize and align rewards and incentives to get the small research community around the world working together. If we can do that, we've got a real chance. If we continue to work in isolation, it's not that things won't happen, it's just the chances are they won't happen quickly enough and they may not happen at all. So by developing a blueprint, it really helps us think about how we focus our strategic investment. So if we gathered up all of the philanthropic and patient-level donations around the world and looked at and mapped out how they're distributed just now, it would look, I think, chaotic. There wouldn't be an obvious unifying strategy or plan. Of course, these donations are doing some good locally, but at a global level, they're probably not taking steps towards prevention or kind of cure. We absolutely need to get academia and industry working together. So in my experience, particularly from a UK perspective and other European countries that now have health technology appraisal, does everybody know what health technology appraisal is? No. So these are the organizations that stand between a product getting a marketing authorization and you getting access to drugs in clinics. So they're set up by governments to give advice to taxpayer-funded health systems and how best to allocate scarce resources. So budgets are capped the same way that my budget's capped at the end of the month. I can't just decide to go to Mallorca for a week's holiday in October. Health system budgets are capped. They have to get the most health benefit out of that budget for patients, and therefore they decide which drugs they're going to fund and which drugs they're not going to fund. So Bettina, I can't remember the PD-1s and different things in melanoma, really struggle to be funded. So across Europe, because HTA bodies were like, we're not sure what the benefit is, and the cost is massive, really, really massive. So being able to get people working together, particularly industry, so we generate better evidence on which to make these decisions, so we're much more competitive. It's so frustrating when you see innovation coming through, but actually you can't get access to it because the trial was not designed properly. There's evidence gaps and payers are not prepared to pay. So by working together, we can generate better evidence to increase the chances of getting access to kind of medicines. And I think most importantly, once you have a sort of blueprint in place and some priorities, then the patient advocacy community then make it their job to hold the research community to account to deliver on these priorities. Really, really important. So what should a research blueprint look like? And these are just kind of straw man. I'm not an expert. But I think what's really important is all the different components of the research strategy must fit together. There must be some logic and some integration between the different parts of the research continuum. Typically, we talk about bench to bedside. So it's a very science, very supply-driven market that we're in. It probably is one of the few remaining industries that's supply-driven. All other industries deliver things that the customer needs or customer wants. Healthcare tends to be more driven by supply and science, and what we have to advocate for in order to allocate scarce resources, in order to do the things that patients need, is join up demand and supply. We have to have a better relationship to make sure that the pipeline is full of things that are needed and things that will give the most benefit for patients, and that is not always the case. So any research strategy has to start with, what is it you want? What do you need? You know, what magnitude of benefit of a drug is acceptable given any given risk? Do you want to have something IV 3 times, 4 times a week for the rest of your life, or would you prefer a drug? You don't always have a lot of choice in that respect, but the more we understand unmet needs, the more we understand your preferences, the more we understand burden of disease, the more we can inform scientists and clinicians and researchers to focus in and generate data on the things that are most important to you. I know there was a couple of talks yesterday I think there was a nurse from Sheffield. I saw it on the internet. Partly it was a very good talk. I'm sorry I missed it. But this is really important because, we're not treating people that have a disease. We're not treating a disease, we're treating people that have a disease, and therefore the clinical environment, the systems, the processes in which you're treated, the way the doctors speak to you, the communication, the information, the support for families and carers is critical as part of that holistic treatment. It's not just about a drug in a person. And when you look at preference studies across the UK and across Europe probably in all cancers, the most important thing for people is sometimes not the treatment, it's all the other bits around it, the holistic needs that patients have. We have complex lives, financial strains, other illnesses, elderly parents, Alzheimer's, disabled kids, learning difficulties, financial worries, redundancy problems. All of these things impact on your ability to make decisions about treatment and care. And these systems are just not in place. The reason they're not in place is we don't have a lot of evidence. We don't really know what it is that patients want. So one of the things we need to do as a community is do health systems and patient-level research to get the data to be able to shape the healthcare environment to meet our needs, and to use that data to inform researchers and suppliers what it is we want, in the same way that Marks and Spencer's or this hotel will have done a gazillion interviews and market testing of products and different things before they built the hotel. We've got to make sure the industry and academia have the evidence from you in terms of what you really, really want in terms of treatment and care. Really important. And if treatments are not going to improve life, and this is maybe a bit morbid, but it's an area in which I'm passionate about, we have to have good deaths. Cancer patients don't often have good deaths because this bit isn't in place. It's not always about getting access to the next innovative drug. Clinical trials, and I know other people have spoken on it, adaptive trial designs and different things, we have to think outside the box in terms of how we prioritize research questions for clinical trials and how we build efficient trial structures and consortia to accelerate the development of data and get the clinical trials right. Because if the data are not there, it's very difficult to get, well, it's not so difficult to get regulatory approval, but it's almost impossible to get payer approval because their data needs are very different to those of the regulator. So really important that there's a plan for this, that the endpoints are appropriate, and that we shouldn't be putting patients into trials that are not important. It just cannot happen. It's such a waste of resource. Then all the way back to the research bench, as it were, and really thinking about the last speaker and trying to unravel the mechanisms that are responsible for the onset and progression of ocular melanoma and trying to figure out mechanistically how it works. So it's not suck it and see with treatments. It's about designing treatments specifically to target a pathway that's implicated in the onset and progression of melanoma. So any research blueprint would have all of these factors in as part of an integrated plan, but the most important thing is to start with the end in mind. I haven't spoken to anybody at NASA, but I'm pretty convinced they didn't start building a spaceship and then wonder where the hell they were going to end up. They knew they were heading to the moon, and then they worked back from there and figured out how to do it. And that's what we've got to do in ocular melanoma. So I don't want to get into the weeds with this. It's tricky because, of course, there's huge egos, there's huge vested interests, there's all kinds of craziness that's standing in the way of your life, actually. And we've got to figure out how to unpick that and put a strategy in place that's inclusive, that involves all stakeholders, including upstream decision makers that may decide to say no to a new drug. And they might turn around and say, why didn't you ask me 5 years ago my opinion of the trial design? Because I don't like it. So there's a lot that needs to be done to figure out how you go from this idea of the need for a blueprint, the rationale for a blueprint, and getting people around the table and saying, right, we've got researchers, we've got clinicians, we've got industry, we've got FDA, we've got EMA, we've got HD, whoever is involved. How do we shape this? So we've got a blueprint. So that's step one. The next step is how do you operationalize that and fund it And how do you get people to behave so that they don't just agree in a meeting because they don't want to be left out, and then they go home and say, we're going to do our plan anyway. And that's where I think two things come in. One is patient advocacy, and the other is incentives. And I have been thrown out of more doctors' offices than probably all of you kind of put together. And what it is, I think, is it's about incentives. Doctors used to say to me, Eric, I'm not sure if I agree with what you're saying or not. It's not the point. The point is you're the only one that's banging on my door asking me to do this. No one else is. And until somebody else tells me I need to change the way I think about research, I'm going to keep going the way I'm going. And it all comes down to money, actually. Money is the biggest incentive for clinicians. So if you can say, right, you can get your money, you can get your paper, all this, but actually do this and not that, they change pretty much in a second. And somebody once said to me, if you want to herd cats, move the food. So we've got to think about how the incentives align across the research continuum so everybody gets out of the plan what they need on a personal and institutional level, but the data and the research that they do makes a contribution to a global plan and a global blueprint so we can move melanoma research from here to here in that amount of time rather than from here to here in that amount of time. That's the goal. Your lives depend on it. So I'm over time, I know. So just in summary, there are significant unmet needs. You know much more about these than me. We know we're a rare cancer, and there's challenges in terms of how we do research in rare disease, but that shouldn't be the excuse to do things poorly. It's the reason to do things brilliantly. We don't have enough resources, so we've got to think about how we allocate these resources carefully, and having some sort of a plan is one way in which we can allocate these scarce resources. Even if the plan is not the best, it's still better than where we are at the moment for sure. And even if only 20% of the community sign up to it, that's still brilliant. And these small gains will add up to transformation when drugs get to patients in the clinic. And this is what advocacy should be doing. There's no point in advocacy just coming in when NICE or EMA or HAS say no to a drug. It's too late by then. The advocacy should start by advocating for the research strategy that's going to deliver increased life and better quality of life for you guys in the short and long term. And the goal is to make sure that every bit of resource that we've got in ocular melanoma leads to the maximum patient benefit in the shortest time possible. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Any questions?
This is when people start throwing things. Doctors.
So I think it's a general question actually, because it might not be something specifically about this presentation, but in practical terms, as a patient, as a stage 4 patient, I asked my doctor, what can I do to help research? And so he's pointed me towards one research study where they can use my tissue after I'm dead. And I've signed up for that, but I did ask him at the time, well, what about UN Cure 2020? I mean, there'll be lots of tissue to go around. Can we make sure that everybody who get, because one of the resources is not just the money, it's the patients and it's the cancer tissue as well that's a scarce resource as well when you've got a rare disease. And I have ended up signing up for a research study in London, and I don't know whether that is the best one to do or not. And when they told me I'm the very first uveal melanoma patient to sign up for it, they have said it has made massive difference to other cancers just this year, the understanding of them. But when they said I'm the first one, then I started to wonder, well, is this the right one? Should I be signing up somewhere else? Should I be? I just didn't know what to do. I literally didn't know.
Okay, so three quick answers. So I think the first thing is that I think all patients should contribute to research. That doesn't mean to say taking part in a clinical trial. I think giving a tissue sample or blood sample or whatever is required is a good thing, but I think what I would do is to make sure that because there's laboratories full of tissues around the world sitting there gathering dust. What's critical is we prioritize the research questions and how we want to interrogate that data. That's critical. So I think the two things go together. We've got to have the resource, but we've got to have the critical questions to interrogate tissue and sample banks with is the first thing. I think the second thing is that one way in which patients can really contribute is by doing burden of disease, by doing patient preference, elicitation, and exploration studies. So there's no bone marrows involved, there's no operations involved, there's no informed, well, might be informed consent. But what's missing in the system is your opinion, your voice, what you want, what you need. We need that data to influence research strategies, payer strategies. So somehow you've got to get together and figure out what type of patient-level data you can generate as a community that will be fundamental in making decisions across the whole research continuum. And then the third thing, when it comes to clinical trials, I'm not an expert, but I know from myeloma, a lot of patients go into trials that are not that important. So I think there needs to be a mechanism whereby there's some sort of map of trials and somehow they're prioritized and matched against what we think research priorities are, because I think patients are in very difficult situations when they're in their doctor's office and they're offered a trial. It's a whole new world. So there needs to be some information, some support mechanism to help patients make informed decisions about their treatment and care. The trial may be the best option. Standard of care, if it's available, may be the best option, or another trial may be the best option. I can't answer that, but there needs to be some process to make sure that when you give your consent, it's truly informed.
Yeah, any other questions?
In your opinion, which of the research strategies in uveal melanoma looks more promising? Studying the intracellular signaling pathways, trying to find a way to block it, or studying the immune system, trying to make the cancerous cells more visible to the immune system?
Sure. So I'm not an expert at that level, but I think if we don't know the answer to that, that's part of the deliberations, discussions that need to go into a research blueprint so we can allocate the right resources and energy to these questions. It might be one or the other, it might be both. I don't know, unfortunately.
Last question.
In an ideal world, if we are working together with clinicians and pharmaceuticals to get all the information in research, what about the benefits and the rights coming from the from working together? Who should have the rights and the benefits at first place?
In terms of IP?
Yes.
Okay. So my view on that would be that having been involved in lots of IP discussions in my previous organization, because we ran trials, it's the single thing that holds things up. From a patient perspective, I would give over IP. I would just let it go over. The chances of getting anything from it anyway is slim. Where our focus should be is making sure that the research that is done, whether industry-led, clinician-led, or a hybrid of them, is the best it can be, is the most appropriate it can be, and let's make sure we can shape the regulatory and the payer systems to make sure there's a fair assessment of the value of that innovation, so we balance out the need for industry to make a profit and the need for health systems to manage their budget so we can get timely access to drugs. I think that's where we need to be focused. The IP thing, I would personally just push to one side. If you as a community generate patient-level data, absolutely you can exploit that from an IP perspective because industry and payers need that. You may decide, actually we'll just give it, we're open source, just give it. But if you've no money, you have to be responsible. You've got to pay staff, you've got to do things so you could, charge a fee to get access to that patient-level data. That's as an option.